9-year-old Princess Charlotte just became the owner of one of the most closely guarded royal estates in British history, and the moment that decision landed, Camilla went into a rage. This estate was supposed to be her golden ticket, her legacy, the one thing that would make sure history never forgot her name. Now, it was gone, handed to a child, and Camilla was not going to sit quietly and accept it. She went straight to Charles with everything she had, threatening him in ways that shocked even the people closest to her. What Charles said back to her stopped her completely cold, and she never saw it coming. Camilla's fury and Charles's silence. Camilla was inside Highgrove when the news reached her, and what unfolded within those walls afterward is something the palace has worked very hard to keep buried. At least one senior aide was present in that building when it all exploded, and what they later described to royal correspondents under strict anonymity was deeply shocking. Camilla erupted with a fury so total and so uncontrolled that it shook everyone around her. She screamed and demanded to know how something this enormous had been decided without her knowledge and without even the basic decency of a warning. What sort of humiliation was that? What made it even more devastating was the weapon Camilla reached for next. She did not simply scream and accept defeat. She told Charles directly that she was going to leak the Charlotte story to the press, and she had exactly the right people to do it through. Her connections to the British tabloid press were not casual relationships built over a few social dinners. These were the same journalists who had published the most intimate details of her private phone calls with Charles during the worst years of the royal scandal. These were the very networks that had spent years slowly rebuilding her public image from despised homewrecker into queen consort. She was going to use every single one of those connections to blow the story wide open. She was going to make the whole thing so loud and so impossible to contain that the palace would be forced to respond. Charles looked at his wife and refused her without a single apology. He told her that his mother's wishes had been legally sealed long before either of them had any say in the matter, and that the trust was permanent with no process anywhere in the world capable of reversing it. Charles told Camilla that if she went to the press and turned this into a public debate, she would not simply lose the argument. She would lose everything she had ever built inside this family, and that he would not protect her from those consequences. The institution had spoken, his mother had decided, and Charles did what Elizabeth had spent an entire lifetime conditioning him to do. He chose the dead woman's decision over his living wife and went completely silent. Does that pattern sound familiar? It should, because back in 1997, when Diana died, the world turned on Charles with a ferocity that still defines how many people see him today. They called him cold and emotionally hollow, and accused him of choosing his mother's iron obsession with institutional composure over any visible human grief for the mother of his own children. That accusation had followed him for nearly 30 years and had never stopped burning. And here he was again, standing in front of his devastated wife and choosing a dead woman's sealed legal arrangement over everything Camilla was going through in that room. Elizabeth had built Charles this way over an entire lifetime, and he had never once found the will to break free of it. Camilla was only now understanding, in the most brutal way possible, exactly what that meant for her future inside this family. To make matters worse, the wound cut even deeper than the estate itself. For years, Camilla had quietly carried a private hope that her position as queen consort would eventually mean something real and lasting for her own children from her first marriage. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes had always lived in one of the most uncomfortable positions imaginable inside the royal world. They were the stepchildren of the King of England, yet they carried no royal titles, received no public funding, and held no formal recognition anywhere inside the institution that their mother now sat at the very center of. What had never been officially confirmed but had circulated persistently in royal media circles was that Camilla had quietly pushed for her grandchildren, meaning the children of Tom and Laura, to receive some form of financial protection through the royal estate structure. She genuinely believed that her position as queen consort gave her at least that much reach after everything she had survived to get there. The Charlotte decision did not simply close that door. It ripped the door completely off its hinges and made brutally clear that the door had never belonged to Camilla in the first place. Elizabeth had watched every single one of Camilla's ambitions taking shape and had drawn the line long before Camilla had even finished forming the thought out loud. But to truly understand why Elizabeth's wishes were so absolute and ruthless, you have to go back to a war that most people never even knew was being fought. Elizabeth's hidden war, why Charlotte was the weapon and the estate nobody was supposed to find. Elizabeth never forgave Camilla, not privately and not behind the polished photographs where the two women stood close enough to appear civil. Whatever Elizabeth allowed the world to see, the private record tells a completely different and far darker story. Elizabeth had a private name for Camilla that she used behind closed doors. Royal biographer Giles Brandreth documented it. Elizabeth called Camilla that woman. Those two words carried everything Elizabeth refused to say in public. All the contempt, all the blame, and all the cold fury of a woman who held Camilla directly responsible for one of the most damaging crises the monarchy had faced in a generation. For years after Diana's marriage collapsed, Elizabeth refused to allow Camilla inside the intimate Sandringham gatherings where the royal family's real private life took place away from cameras and public eyes. She tolerated Camilla's presence in Charles's life because the affair was already public and the institution demanded composure. But tolerating someone and trusting them are two completely different things, and Elizabeth never once confused them. Then came 1992 and the Camillagate tape, and whatever thin thread of goodwill might have existed between them broke permanently without any possibility of repair. The Sunday Mirror published an intercepted phone call between Charles and Camilla that became one of the most humiliating royal scandals of the entire 20th century. The contents were intimate, deeply degrading, and completely impossible to walk back once the world had heard them. Elizabeth heard every word of it. Palace sources cited in Robert Lacey's Battle of Brothers revealed that she told her private secretary directly that Camilla was a destabilizing force and that the marriage to Diana had to be saved at whatever cost was necessary. But that effort failed completely. Diana and Charles divorced in 1996. Elizabeth carried the weight of that failure quietly for the rest of her life, and she never stopped knowing exactly who was responsible for it. In 2005, when Charles and Camilla finally married, Elizabeth refused to attend the civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall. The official explanation given to the public was that it was inappropriate for the head of the Church of England to attend a civil remarriage involving a divorced person. But multiple royal biographers, including Penny Junor and Sarah Bradford, reported that the real reason went far deeper than protocol. Elizabeth found the entire arrangement personally repugnant. Her private secretary, Robin Janvrin, spent weeks in tense negotiations just to establish the bare minimum terms of her participation, including her absolute insistence that no public statement would describe her as endorsing the marriage in any form. She attended the blessing at Windsor Castle afterward because the institution required her presence. Elizabeth had accepted Camilla publicly because she had run out of ways to prevent it. But from that moment forward, she began building a legal wall between Camilla and every piece of private wealth she personally controlled. Now understand what that wall was protecting and why it mattered so deeply. The estate at the center of this story is called Abbebystead, a 23,000-acre private working estate buried deep in Lancashire that most people have never even heard of. Abbebystead sits within the Duchy of Lancaster's private property holdings, which is essentially the private financial estate of the reigning monarch of England. It has operated for centuries completely outside freedom of information requests and outside virtually every transparency law that applies to public institutions in Britain. Its value sits somewhere between 30 and 50 million pounds. Its buildings do not appear on standard public maps, and every staff member signs a secrecy agreement before setting foot on the grounds. What makes this estate even darker is something the palace has never publicly acknowledged. In 1984, a catastrophic methane gas explosion ripped through Abbebystead's water treatment facility and killed 16 people without warning. Local residents and council officials invited to inspect the pumping station died on the spot. Their families spent years fighting Crown-adjacent authorities for compensation in one of the bitterest legal battles in British rural history. and that history was quietly buried in the decades that followed. The fact that this land, carrying that kind of grief and blood in its history, now sits registered in the name of a 9-year-old princess is a dark irony the palace will never willingly address. Now understand why it was specifically Charlotte who received it. Prince George will one day inherit the crown estate, the Duchy of Cornwall, and the full financial weight of the British throne, so he needed nothing more added to that. But Charlotte exists inside a legal structure that still formally treats her as secondary simply because of her sex. The Duchy of Cornwall, worth well over £1 billion, passes automatically to the eldest son of the sovereign and not the eldest child. What that means in plain terms is that if William and Kate had raised only daughters, the entire duchy would have bypassed every single one of them and passed to a male relative instead. Elizabeth understood this painful reality because she had watched it destroy the person she loved most in the world. Princess Margaret was refused permission in 1955 to marry Peter Townsend, the man she loved, because the church and the government would not sanction the marriage. Elizabeth could not override the decision without threatening the stability of the throne, so she allowed her own sister to be broken apart by the institution she had sworn to protect. Margaret spent the rest of her life financially dependent on Elizabeth. She died in 2002 with her legacy reduced to a bittersweet story of glamour and private suffering. Elizabeth carried that guilt for 50 years. Charlotte's inheritance is the apology she could never give her sister, delivered instead to the next generation before history could repeat itself. By placing Abbebystead in Charlotte's name, Elizabeth locked Camilla out of it permanently with no appeal and no door left open anywhere. And while Camilla was falling completely apart at Highgrove and demanding answers from a husband who had already chosen silence, Kate was doing what she has always done when things get dangerous inside the palace. Kate's silent hand and what Charlotte becomes. Kate said nothing publicly. She issued no statement and made no appearance that suggested she was even aware of the storm that was tearing through the palace. But here is what most people do not know. Kate had always known about Charlotte's inheritance long before it became public knowledge. She had not simply been informed of Elizabeth's plans after they were already finalized. Kate had helped build them. Everything that was now destroying Camilla had been quietly and deliberately shaped, at least in part, by Kate's own careful and patient hands. The late Queen and Kate had repeated private conversations about Charlotte's future in the years before Elizabeth died. Those conversations directly influenced the final legal structure of the trust that now holds the estate. The timing of when the confirmation would surface, the specific legal protections built into the trust to make it impossible to challenge, and the careful selection of the trustees who would manage the estate until Charlotte came of age were all shaped by what Kate advocated for in those private discussions. Kate had not fought for any of this loudly or publicly. She had made her position known persistently and without aggression, in exactly the way that Elizabeth respected most deeply, and Elizabeth had listened to every single word of it. To understand why Kate fought so hard for this outcome, you have to understand something about her own past that almost nobody connects to this story. Before the title and the global recognition, Kate spent nearly a decade in a position that quietly humiliated her in ways the public only partially understood. She was financially dependent on her parents during those years, and the British press mocked her openly, calling her Weighty Katie, and describing her as a woman whose entire future rested entirely on whether one man eventually decided to propose. That period left a mark on Kate that did not simply disappear when the proposal finally came. People who know Kate closely say she has spoken privately about making absolutely certain that Charlotte never finds herself anywhere near a position like that. The estate is Kate's direct answer to her own painful past. It is a mother using every ounce of hard-earned influence to make sure her daughter begins her adult life standing on a ground that no man and no institution can ever pull out from under her. There is one more detail buried inside the trust's legal structure that Camilla's legal team has reportedly been trying to access for months without any success. Royal trusts established for minors in Britain typically include what legal experts call a default beneficiary clause. which is a provision that determines exactly where the assets go if the primary beneficiary dies before she is old enough to take legal control of the estate herself. In Charlotte's trust, the identity of the default beneficiary has not been made public. Constitutional legal experts have pointed out that whoever holds that position carries significant legal leverage over how Charlotte eventually manages the estate once she reaches adulthood. The question of who that person is and why that specific piece of information has been kept completely sealed is one the palace has refused to answer. Camilla cannot touch the estate. She cannot reverse the trust. She cannot even find out who stands to benefit if something happens to Charlotte before she comes of age. Elizabeth sealed every single door before she died, and she took every key with her. What Charlotte is growing toward is something with almost no real precedent for a woman in British royal history. She will reach adulthood as the owner of a privately held estate worth between 30 and 50 million pounds, sitting completely outside the formal succession structure and answerable to trustees that Charlotte herself will eventually take full control of. No future king can redirect it. No palace budget review can touch it. No husband will ever hold any legal claim over it. The estate was secured for Charlotte before she was even old enough to understand what was being built in her name. It was built specifically to survive everything that the royal world might one day attempt to take from her. And there is absolutely nothing left that Camilla can do about it.